Hi and welcome to this video in the QPSMR Companion Digging Deeper series. In this video we're going to be looking at the question settings that you have available when you're preparing your questionnaire for the QPSMR Companion. So let's get started, and first of all, just to say there are no accompanying files for this particular video, as it really is just a tour of the system to familiarise yourself with the settings you have available. So let's get started. So let's first of all insert a question entry, and let's look at the things that we can set on this screen. In this video we're going to be exploring the question, the extra and the settings tabs. Filters and the responses settings are shown in a separate video, so if you're more interested in those you'll need to watch the relevant videos. So let's get started. So the first thing to talk about is the question name. Now you're allowed a question name of up to 30 characters in QPSMR, but I think there's some rules that are worth following because it makes it easier when you're using some of the tools within QPSMR, or indeed if you export this to other software you might have some problems. So our recommendation is that although you can have any characters you like for your variable names, I think it's good practice to stick to variable names that use A to Z, 0 to 9 and underscore, because any other characters like minus sign, percentage sign, ampersand sometimes has problems in other software when you export, and we wouldn't want you to have problems when you try to export the software to somebody else's platform. So that's a recommendation, but you are limited to 30 characters within the QPSMR Companion. You can have names like 1 ampersand *3 if you wanted to. You start to get in difficulties with that if you want to hand this project over to, for example, to MRDCL. You then have to refer to those variables because they don't begin with a letter in quotes, and I wouldn't even use just one as a name for a variable either, even though it is valid. I would always precede it with a letter, so you use Q1, Q2. It's just better practice, I think. So I'm going to start with typing in Q1, and we're going to now look first of all at the question types that we have available and just work through those and understand those fully. So the first option on the list there is single coded response only, and what that means is when data is being entered or collected, you're only allowed no response or one response. You can't have more than one response, and there's no override to that in any way, so you really should restrict it to things like yes, no questions, very good to very poor, and questions like that, or perhaps age groups where people fall into one of 5 age groups. It really isn't appropriate where you have a question, for example, where you ask someone what's your favourite television programme, where somebody might quite easily pick 2 answers and there'll be no way of entering that if you make it single coded. So important to know that, but it allows you then to have a list of responses to that question that a respondent can give. The next one down, multi-coded responses allowed. Well, that means that any number of answers are appropriate at that particular question. So that would be fine if you wanted to ask people which brands they'd ever bought, for example, because they could have bought no brands, one brand, or indeed any number of the brands on your list. So multi-coded responses allowed is a list of responses, but you're allowed as many of those to be answered or given or selected as you wish. And we'll look at some of the settings to restrict that in a little minute when we go on to some of the other settings that you've got available. The next option down is an integer, so that's where you want to collect a whole number. If you were to type in 2.7 or something to an integer, it would just round it to the nearest number as 3, and likewise if it's 0.5 it would just round it up to the nearest number. So it's a whole number it's going to store here, whatever you do for data collection or data import. Floating point, that does allow decimal places. That allows you to have decimal places in your number, so you could collect 13.75 for example, and that would be preserved with the decimal point in there. Now, character data is where you actually want to collect a text string, typically not for analysis, but more for reference, or perhaps for outputting into other files, or to keep data tidy in some way. So, for example, someone's email address might appear in there, perhaps the city they live, but normally just text that you aren't going to do much with. It's not for an open-ended question where you're collecting verbatim text. That comes further down the list, as you'll see 2 or 3 ahead. Date and time are mainly restricted to where you're going to have CATI surveys in place where you want to record the time and date of an interview. So they're not relevant in most surveys, but they do apply to CATI surveys where dates for calling respondents or times to call respondents are recorded. Next we come to verbatim, and that's what I just referred to just now. That's where you want to collect data and record exactly what someone says, possibly their reasons for buying something, and you want to have or enter information such as I bought the product because it's the cheapest one available, or something like that, some words that they actually said. Now that data then gets stored in a CSV file so that at a later stage, if you want to, you can code that back with using codes. So you could put cost or price or something as a code 1, people who like the packaging as code 2, and code that back to the main data by coding it in a spreadsheet or using a coding program to feed that back. So that's a really nice tool for handling open-ended questions. And then you've got finally a question that's not a question, if I can say that. That's where you have text for the interviewer, so there's no question to ask, but it might be something you want the interviewer to read out to a respondent, or it might be just a reminder to a interviewer to actually take some action. So they're the options that you can choose. Now, with all those options, different things are available and applicable in the other tabs. But let's sort of come back a step first. Let's look around the rest of this screen first of all. So the width of an answer, you can choose what width you have for an answer if you wish to, but typically you leave QPS to decide where it's going to store your data. So you can see over here that it's going to store it in the 10th location, the data from question 1. Now that's usually fine. You usually don't care what QPS does, but perhaps it's worth understanding how QPS stores data. So behind the scenes, what QPS is doing is building a map, if you like, and it's saying, well, question 1 I'll store in the 10th location, question 2 in the 11th. Let's say question 3's got 9 multi-responses. It might store that in 12 to 20 as code 1s, for example. Or it might store a multi sometimes as a spread field, which is another way of storing data, so that if somebody answers 1, 3 and 5, it'll actually store 01, 03, 05 in consecutive fields. Now that can be a much tidier way of storing multis. So say you have a list of 500 brands, makes and models of cars that someone might buy or own. They probably own perhaps 1 or none or 2 or 3 of those makes and models at the very most. So rather than having 900 or 500, I think I said, 500 codes that are checked true or false, which would take up 500 fields as 1s and 0s or 1s and blanks, you could just store the 2 cars that they own as 207 and 209 in 2 3-digit fields, and that's called a spread field, and that's a very efficient way of storing data. And it's a format that's supported by SSS and SPSS and many other programs as a convenient way of storing data. You can of course convert it to a longer form if you wish to, which some software insists on as being a series of 1s and 0s if you've got 500 brands. So most would be set to 0 in my example, and 498 of them might be set to 0, and just the 2 would be set to 1 in a relevant field. So that's what QPS is doing. It's storing behind the scenes where it stores your data, and it's allowing you to set the width. Now that becomes important certainly with things like integers. So if you're asking people how many cars they own, it's probably unlikely they're going to own more than really outside 99. So you might store that as a 2-digit field. But if you ask someone how many miles they travelled in their car each year or how many kilometres they travelled, You might want to set that to 6 digits because they could easily travel 100,000 kilometers in a year. Less likely to be 6 digits, probably 5, but you can set the width to being an amount that is adequate for the largest figure you expect to collect. So that setting is important, that width, and has importance certainly with integers always, and sometimes with other types of fields that you're collecting. Now, whether you care where the data is stored in QPSMR is your choice. In most cases, I would suggest you don't care where it's storing the data. That might be different if you have a tracking study where you're wishing to store the data in the same locations from wave to wave. Or it might be where the client perhaps has specified exactly where they want each question stored, and in which case then you would want to set this. You would go out of this, so let's leave what I've just done here, go to the global settings, go to data, and here, rather than letting the program set the locations for the data, you would turn this switch on, save it, and now if we insert a question, you'll see that every question is your choice where you put that data, because you're deciding where to map the data to. So it comes with a responsibility, if you like, to make sure you've planned where you're going to put that data. Now that is not the norm, but it's something that you will want to consider if you have a client who wishes you to put data out to particular locations. All right, so let's get back to our main screen here. Now this checkbox here that you see, individual locations, individual locks. Now the purpose of that particular checkbox there is that it will put every single code that you have for response questions in a separate field. So even single response questions where there are 5 responses and you could store those all within one field as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it would store them as ones across 5 consecutive fields. So it's unusual that that's required, but again, some software demands that, and you might wish to store your data in that particular format. All right, let's get into looking at some of the specific formats that you need, or settings that you need for particular question types. So let's go through some of the question types now and look at the settings that you might want. So we put in question 1, we've chosen single response only. Let's first of all go into the extra tab here and just look at what we've got here. So this applies to all question types, so I won't cover it again, but this is some text that you can output on a paper questionnaire that has extra instructions before the question or after the question, or has some instructions for anybody doing data entry where perhaps you've got to remind them to do something. So that extra there is applicable to all question types, but only works on paper questionnaires. Now let's go to the settings menu, because there's a whole series of different things here, some of which are applicable to single, some of which are applicable to other types of questions. So let's have a look at some of these things. All right, so let's look at when we've got a single question, we have 2 settings here, sample point and quota entry. Now they're only applicable if you're using the CATI facilities in QPSMR. So they allow you to select a particular question on your questionnaire as a sample point or as a quota point, and that will be true of any variables that you specify as well. They could be set, but they must be single entries. They can't be multis. Only single entries can be set as quota points and sample points, and this is covered more fully in the videos on CATI. Now let's look around a little bit further and see what other options we got here. Well, we've got a suspend input here, so that means that the question is hidden and you can't see it. We've got a blank allowed checkbox here, so what that means is that on CAPI and CATI, blank is allowed, whereas it doesn't affect paper, but on CAPI and CATI, blank is allowed. Without that, every question has to be answered, or you need a code to say not answered, so that the interviewer, whether it's a telephone interviewer or a CAPI interviewer, can actually check an answer to proceed to the next question. Randomized responses, that does what it says it does. It will mean that when the questionnaire is presented, the responses will be randomized. Now that doesn't apply to a paper survey, but again, to CAPI and CATI, that will apply. So the answers that come up on the screen would be randomized, and you wouldn't typically do that with a single response question. That's more common that you do that with a multi-response question where you perhaps got a list of 12 brands and you want to randomize the order that they're presented so that there's not a bias amongst respondents. All right, so there's some of the things that we're going to look at there. Let's come back and close this and look at some other question types. So let's now come back in here and let's look at a multi and see what settings we get here. Well, pretty much the same answers except the CATI one now has disappeared. Everything else looks pretty much the same. So that's pretty good news. Down here, we've got two questions which are very useful with multi-response questions. Pre-select means that you want to pull answers through from a previous question, and that may be from another question, another entry I should say more accurately, from another question or from a variable that you have defined. So for example, if you wanted to ask people which brands they were spontaneously aware of, they would perhaps select 3 brands. You might want those answers automatically selected when it came to the prompted awareness so that you could just add the additional brands. Alternatively, to use that scenario again, you might want to preclude all the answers given spontaneously so that they're not available at the prompted awareness question. And then you might want a question that doesn't really appear on the questionnaire that automatically selects from a variable the spontaneous plus the prompted awareness questions to have a question that doesn't, or an entry that doesn't actually appear on the questionnaire, but is just the combination of those 2 questions added together. So it's a way of pulling through answers from previous questions or restricting answers from previous questions, or having a sort of dummy question that's not really on the questionnaire but is adding together or adding responses from 1 or more questions together or 2 or more questions together to produce some responses in an entry or a variable that can be used easily in analysis. But basically to save the person doing analysis to do that amalgamation of data. So that's what's in there. So that's in the going for a single. So close that window. Let's go back now and look at another type of entry. Let's look at an integer. We go into the settings now. Now you can see some more things coming up here. You can see that when that cell or that actual entry is full, it moves on automatically so that you can't possibly try and put in an answer that's too big. You're also allowed here to set the range of answers. So if you were asking someone a percentage, for example, you might set the range here to be 0 to 100, for example, so that no one could fall outside that range. Now down here you'll see that you can add some other values to that, and that's because sometimes people like to set 999 to mean not answered, or 998 to mean some other answer, such as a lot or something like that. When somebody answers a lot or most of the time, you might want to record 998 there because it's a value, but it's not a specific value. So all of these things here can be used to check at data entry that no one's putting in a value outside the range. And to use this example, if it was a percentage and someone tried to put in 110, that would come up as an error so that it couldn't be used or couldn't be allowed at data entry. All right, so that's looking at an integer. Let's go back again. Let's now look at something to consider now with a floating point. Now with a floating point and an integer, and I should have mentioned this integer, you have to set the width that is the maximum width. So in the case of percentage there, the maximum width would have been 3 characters. If it was in the range of 0 to 100, it couldn't be more than that. But you have to be careful to make sure that you make it big enough. Don't ever allow for an answer bit to be too big. So if you're going to ask someone an answer where you expect it to be less than 100, but it could be more than 100, make it 3 digits so that you know you're not going to exceed the field size, because there's no way of collecting it if that data if you get it wrong. And what you can also do here now is, if you've got floating point, you also have to account for the decimal places. So you might make the width 6 and allow 2 decimal places here. So that would mean you would have up to 3 digits before the decimal place, 1 for the decimal place, and 2 decimal places. And any data you entered would have to fit into the rules for that. So it couldn't be bigger than 999.99. So it's important to think about that, because the decimal place is going to take up one of the characters in the width. You want 3 characters before it. And if you entered 3 decimal places, rather like the way it works with an integer, it would just round it to 2 decimal places for you. So if somebody put in 0.453, it would just round that to 0.45 as the nearest, taking off that decimal place and rounding to the nearest 2 decimal places. So it's important to get that right when you're thinking about floating point. All right, so that's handled all of that. Let's close this again. Let's come back and look at character data. And here, if we look at the settings, we get some different things in here now. We can set the width as before, because character data has to have a width. And we've got some settings here as well. So we've got the ability to record the data as it's typed. So if it uses upper and lower case, it will appear in the data file as upper and lower case. If we check this radio button here, it will all be uppercased, regardless of whether the text is entered as lower or uppercase. It all ends up as uppercase, and of course here it'll all be set as lowercase, regardless of whether it's entered as upper or lowercase. All right, let's move on. Now in this case, when you select the text for interviewer, there is a setting that's slightly hidden, I always think, but you can find it down here, where you have the ability to show a picture. And it's not actually just a picture. It allows you to select videos. You can see there's a whole series of different types of file that you can load in here. So you can load in a whole range of picture files, audio files, or video files, so that they can be shown to a respondent. Now that's obviously only applicable to CAPI interviews, but it means that if you want to show a picture, it's not just a picture, show media, I guess it ought to say there. It allows you to do that by checking that box and then selecting the file that you want to show at the stage of an interview. So that's a little checkbox there that's sometimes easy to miss, but it's down there hidden away. Now we have got some other settings in here, so let's just have a look at those. Let's go back in again and let's look at some of the other settings we've got in here. So we have got some information down here where we can put some routing text. Now this is just pure text, so if we put some text in here, it will allow you to put a question on a paper questionnaire to where an interviewer should go or a respondent should go for the next question. So if we put that radio button there, we can put in or select a question where they go next. It has no effect on the actual routing of the questionnaire at either the time of interview for CAPI and CATI or on a paper questionnaire. It is purely text on a paper questionnaire. And if you want an instruction, you can just type in some text here and that will appear on the questionnaire, or it could be something informative like go to section go to section 3, for example. So there's things like that that you can do. And I managed to spell that wrongly. Okay, so there's some different things you can do there when it comes to handling how that all works. All right, and finally, I'm going to just talk quickly about, I'm going to clear this, one other type of option that you have. These are the filters and responses. Now, to talk about those, I'm not going to talk about them in this video. Filters are covered in a separate video in great depth, how you apply them to questions and responses. So that's the subject of a different video. And likewise with responses, there's some options down here. So if we quickly change this to a single response question and go to responses, you'll see there's options down here for input and analysis that can control the input and analysis. But again, that's covered in a subsequent video. So that's given you a tour around the question settings that you have for QPSMR. I hope that's been useful to you, but please keep watching our videos. You'll find them very informative and help you to get the most out of the QPSMR companion. Thank you.